Hi folks, welcome. Today we're exploring the story of Charles Bennett, a detective haunted by an unsolved case from his past that's come back to torment him in the most sinister way. A string of gruesome murders, mysterious symbols, and an enemy who knows Charles all too well will push him to the edge. Can he stop this twisted game before it destroys everything he holds dear? Subscribe, like, and share to stay tuned. Let's begin. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the streets of Salt Lake City, Utah. The orange glow mingled with the encroaching darkness, as if the day itself was reluctant to surrender to the night. Charles Bennett, a seasoned detective with a penchant for solitude, felt the weight of the dusk settle on his shoulders like a cloak woven from the fabric of his own regrets. He had always preferred the quiet of the night, the whispers of secrets lurking just beyond the reach of streetlights. Tonight, however, the night held a different kind of promise, a sinister allure. The call came in just as he was about to pour himself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid shimmering in the low light of his cramped apartment. A body had been discovered in a back alley, and he was needed on the scene. Charles sighed, knowing that there was no ignoring the persistent tug of duty that pulled at him, despite the exhaustion weighing him down. As he drove through the city, the familiar streets seemed alien under the darkening sky. Neon lights flickered to life, casting a gaudy glow that contrasted sharply with the impending dread that hung in the air. He arrived at the alley, a narrow passageway nestled between crumbling brick buildings, where the stench of decay mingled with the metallic tang of blood. The crime scene was a world apart from the bustling city outside, a microcosm of horror hidden in plain sight. Flashing lights illuminated the scene, and uniformed officers stood like sentinels, their faces grim. The coroner was already at work, and Charles could feel the knot of anticipation tightening in his stomach. He pushed through the crowd, his heart racing as he approached the lifeless body of a young woman sprawled on the ground, her face pale and serene, as if she had simply fallen asleep. The sight sent a shiver down his spine. Her hair lay splayed around her head like a dark halo, and a peculiar wooden box rested beside her, intricately carved with symbols he couldn't quite place. It was the kind of detail that would haunt him long after he left the scene. A bloodied feather lay on top of the box, stark against the cool pavement, a grotesque testament to the violence that had taken place. "Detective Bennett," Lisa Martinez called out, her voice cutting through the oppressive silence. She was his partner, a relentless investigator with a sharp mind and an even sharper wit. As she approached, her brow furrowed in concern. "You've got to see this," he nodded, crouching beside the body as Lisa knelt next to him. "What do you have?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Look at the symbols," she said, pointing to the box. "They're similar to those in that cold case from 10 years ago, the one you never could shake off." Charles's breath caught in his throat. The memories came rushing back, faces, names, the weight of guilt that had plagued him for years. "I thought we were done with that," he replied, his voice laced with disbelief. "Clearly, someone doesn't agree," Lisa replied, her eyes scanning the scene. "This feels personal, Charles, like someone is sending a message." The implications of her words hung heavy in the air, and Charles felt a chill creep up his spine. This wasn't just another murder. It was a thread woven into the fabric of his own history. As he reached out to touch the box, a sense of foreboding washed over him. What if this was the beginning of something darker? Something that threatened to unravel not just the case, but his very sanity. Just then, a sound echoed through the alley, a distant siren, growing louder, more insistent. The noise pulled him from his reverie, and he knew they needed to move quickly. The past was calling him back, and he could no longer ignore it. "Let's get this box to the lab," he said, his voice firm, yet tinged with the trepidation of what lay ahead. "I have a feeling this is just the tip of the iceberg." As they worked, Charles couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness had come for him, a specter from the past returning to claim its due. In that moment, he He knew he was trapped in a game with no clear rules, where every decision could lead to destruction or redemption. With a heavy heart and a mind racing with possibilities, he stepped deeper into the shadows, ready to confront the echoes of his own mistakes. In the heart of Salt Lake City, the night was just beginning, and the call of darkness had never been louder. The next morning, a gray mist blanketed Salt Lake City, shrouding its familiar contours in a ghostly haze. Charles Bennett sat at his desk in the dimly lit precinct, staring at the wooden box that now rested like a sinister artifact before him. The air was thick with tension, and the caffeine in his coffee barely stirred his weary mind. He felt trapped in a waking nightmare, the echoes of a past he thought he had buried clawing their way back to the surface. The morning shift was sluggish, officers murmuring about mundane incidents and petty thefts, but Charles was preoccupied. He opened the box, its intricate carvings almost hypnotic, swirling with symbols that seemed to writhe and twist under his gaze. Each symbol pulsed with a memory, drawing him into a world he had long tried to forget. The haunting visage of Sarah Whitman, the victim from that long-ago case, flickered in his mind like an old film reel. Her smile, her laughter, the day he had failed to protect her, those memories gnawed at him, insistent and unforgiving. "Charles!" Lisa's voice broke through his reverie. She stormed into the room, a folder clutched tightly in her hand, her expression a mix of excitement and urgency. "You need to see this." He pushed the box aside, refocusing as she dropped the folder onto his desk. It slid open, revealing photographs of the previous case, images of Sarah, vibrant and full of life, juxtaposed with the crime scene that had become a haunting memory. "What did you find?" he asked, his pulse quickening. "Witness statements," she replied, her eyes alight with determination. "I went through the archives and found something interesting, details we overlooked back then. There were 2 more people seen near the scene the night Sarah was killed, and their descriptions match some of the symbols on that box." Charles's heart raced as he flipped through the pages, his mind racing with the implications. "We need to track them down," he said, the old fire of determination igniting within him. "If they're connected, they might have answers about why this is happening again." Lisa nodded, her brows knitting in concentration. "But we might face resistance. The higher-ups want us to let this case go. They think you're too obsessed with it." A flash of anger surged through him. "Obsessed? This is a chance to right a wrong. I won't let them silence me again." His voice was steadier than he felt, but the prospect of uncovering the truth fueled him. The day unfolded like a dark tapestry as they delved deeper into the investigation, piecing together fragments of the past. The precinct was a maze of buzzing phones and clattering keys, and Charles felt the weight of history pressing down upon him, thick as the fog outside. Hours later, they stood before an old, forgotten apartment complex on the outskirts of the city, where the 2 witnesses had once lived. The building loomed like a decaying relic, its windows dark and lifeless, echoing the ghosts of those who had once called it home. As they approached, a shiver raced down Charles's spine, as if the very walls whispered secrets meant to be forgotten. "Are you sure about this?" Lisa asked, her voice low. "What if they're not willing to talk?" "They have to," he replied, steeling himself. "They were there that night. They know something." The door creaked open as they stepped inside, revealing a dimly lit hallway cloaked in shadows. The air was thick with dust, and every footfall echoed like a heartbeat in the silence. As they moved down the corridor, the oppressive atmosphere heightened his senses, drawing him closer to the truth buried within. They approached apartment 4B, where one of the witnesses lived. Charles knocked, the sound reverberating through the stillness. Moments later, the door opened to reveal an older man, his face etched with lines of worry and suspicion. "What do you want?" the man grumbled, his eyes darting between them. "Mr. Turner," Charles said, forcing his voice to remain calm despite the turmoil churning inside him. "We need to ask you about the night Sarah Whitman was murdered. It's important." The man hesitated, then stepped aside reluctantly, allowing them entry. The room was cluttered, filled with faded photographs and old newspapers, remnants of a lifelong past. Charles felt the weight of time pressing in, the memories swirling like dust motes in the air. Why should I talk about that? Turner's voice trembled, and Charles noted the flicker of fear in his eyes. I don't want to relive that night. Because it's happening again, Charles said, his voice low but urgent. A young woman is dead, and the same symbols from that night are involved. We think you might know something that could help us. Turner's face paled, and he glanced at the floor as if searching for the right words. I didn't see much, just shadows, and I heard them. There were strange noises, whispers that didn't belong to this world. Whispers? Lisa pressed, her eyes narrowing. What do you mean? I don't know, he stammered, his hands shaking. It felt like something was watching us. The night was alive with it. I was too scared to look outside. I just wanted to forget. Charles felt the chill of dread creeping up his spine. But you saw someone. A man? Turner hesitated, the shadows dancing across his face. Yes, a figure, cloaked in darkness. He was calling her name. The words hung in the air like a ghostly echo, and Charles's heart raced as the weight of realization settled over him. This was not just a case. It was a continuation of a nightmare he thought he had escaped. The threads of the past were weaving into the present, and he could no longer deny the horrifying connection. As they left the apartment, a sense of urgency gripped Charles. The darkness was closing in, the echoes of the past growing louder, and he knew that they were running out of time. With each revelation, the stakes climbed higher, and he felt the pull of fate tightening around him. Determined to uncover the truth, he turned to Lisa, the fire of resolve igniting in his eyes. We need to find that man. He's the key to stopping this before it happens again. The night was still young, and the shadows were watching, hungry for their next move. In the depths of Salt Lake City, the echoes of the past had risen, and Charles Bennett was ready to confront them head-on. Salt Lake City had taken on a sinister sheen under the pale morning light. Charles Bennett leaned against the window of his cramped office, staring out at the cityscape that had become both familiar and foreign. The cacophony of honking horns and distant voices was drowned out by the pounding of his heart. A chilling realization washed over him. The shadows from his past were weaving themselves into the present, creating a tapestry of dread that threatened to consume him. Chance! Lisa's voice burst into the room, breaking through his fog of introspection. She strode in, her eyes ablaze with urgency, clutching a file that seemed to pulse with significance. You need to see this. He turned, intrigued but wary. What now? We got a tip, she replied, flipping open the folder to reveal grainy photographs and documents. There's been a string of suspicious activities at the old Montgomery Theater. It's been abandoned for years, but lately there have been reports of lights flickering and strange noises coming from inside. The theater loomed large in his mind, a relic of forgotten glory that had fallen into disrepair. Its crumbling facade and cracked marquee were the last remnants of a once vibrant hub of creativity. Why would anyone be there? He asked, brow furrowing. What's the connection? Witnesses say they've seen a man matching the description of the figure Turner mentioned. Lisa replied, her tone serious. He's been lurking around the area. I think it's worth checking out. Charles felt a surge of adrenaline. The theater had been a backdrop in his life, a place where dreams had flickered to life and died in the shadows. If there was any chance the figure was linked to the murders, they had to investigate. Let's go, he said, the decision igniting a fire in his gut. The drive to the theater was punctuated by silence. Both of them lost in their thoughts. The morning sun cast a pale glow over the city, illuminating the streets they sped through, but it couldn't chase away the darkness creeping into Charles's mind. He replayed the details of the past, the way the shadows had swallowed Sarah's laughter, turning it into a haunting memory that echoed in his heart. As they arrived at the Montgomery Theater, a sense of foreboding washed over him. The building stood like a gravestone, its windows dark and lifeless, the air thick with the scent of mildew and decay. The marquee hung crooked, letters missing, spelling out nothing but the emptiness that surrounded it. "Do you hear that?" Lisa whispered, her voice barely above a murmur. Charles strained to listen, and a low hum reverberated through the air, a sound that was both eerie and inviting. It beckoned him forward, urging him to step into the abyss. "Yeah," he replied, steeling himself. "Let's see what's inside." They stepped through the cracked doorway, the hinges creaking like the whispers of ghosts long forgotten. The interior was shrouded in darkness, dust motes dancing in the faint light that filtered through broken windows. Rows of decaying seats loomed before them, and the air felt heavy, as if the theater itself was holding its breath. "Stay close," Charles instructed, gripping his flashlight tightly as they made their way down the center aisle. Each step echoed ominously, reverberating off the walls like a countdown to an inevitable confrontation. Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught his eye. Something darted through the shadows near the stage. "Did you see that?" he asked, heart racing. "Yeah, let's check it out," Lisa replied, her voice steady despite the fear lacing her words. They crept closer, each footfall deliberate as they navigated the debris-strewn floor. As they approached the stage, a figure emerged from the darkness, silhouetted against the dim glow of a flickering light. It was a man, his features obscured, but the essence of danger radiated from him like a storm about to break. "Who are you?" Charles demanded, his voice echoing through the empty theater. The figure laughed, a low, chilling sound that reverberated in the air. "You've come searching for answers, haven't you?" His voice was smooth, tainted with malice. "But be careful what you wish for, detective. Some truths are better left buried." Charles felt a cold sweat trickle down his spine as the man stepped into the light, revealing a face he recognized all too well. An old colleague from the force, a name he had buried deep in his memory. "Martin," he gasped, the realization crashing over him like a tidal wave. "What are you doing here?" Martin grinned, but there was no warmth in it, only a cold, twisted glee. "I've been watching you, Charles, you and your little obsession with the past. You've always been so predictable." "Stop playing games," Lisa snapped, stepping forward. "What do you know about the murders?" "Oh, it's more than just murders," Martin replied, his voice dripping with mockery. "It's about the connections, the ties that bind us. You see, Charles, this city is riddled with secrets, and I've learned to navigate the web that holds it all together." Charles felt the weight of his own past pressing in on him, the memories of failed cases and lost lives swirling like a storm in his mind. "What do you want?" he demanded, anger igniting within him. "I want to show you the truth," Martin replied, his eyes glinting with a manic fervor. "I want to unveil the darkness that festers beneath this city, one victim at a time. You were always too blind to see it." Before Charles could react, Martin turned and sprinted toward the backstage area, disappearing into the shadows. "Get after him," Lisa shouted, urgency lacing her words. They chased after him, adrenaline coursing through their veins as they darted into the darkened recesses of the theater. Each corner turned felt like a descent deeper into hell, the echoes of their footsteps mingling with the whispers of the past. As they rounded the final corner, they stumbled into a hidden room, cluttered with old stage props and forgotten dreams. The air was thick with dust and the scent of decay. Martin stood at the far end, a grotesque grin plastered on his face. "Welcome to my lair," he sneered. "You see, Charles, this is where the real show begins." He gestured to the walls, and Charles's blood ran cold. Photos plastered everywhere, each one depicting the faces of past victims, connected by strings of red yarn that crisscrossed like the tangled web of madness he had stepped into. Each face bore the weight of a life cut short, and in the center hung a large portrait of Sarah, her smile a haunting reminder of his failure. "Why are you doing this?" Charles shouted, rage and despair mingling in his throat. "What's your endgame?" Martin's laughter echoed through the room, chilling Charles to the bone. "You are always so fixated on the past, Charles. But it's not about revenge, it's about control. The power to create fear, to manipulate those too weak to see the truth. You've been my perfect little pawn." The walls seemed to close in, the weight of the revelations crashing over him. Charles felt as if he were drowning in a sea of shadows, each realization deeper and darker than the last. Before he could react, Martin lunged forward, knocking Charles off balance. They tumbled to the ground, grappling for control as Lisa shouted for backup. The chaos spiraled around them, each moment stretching into eternity as Charles fought against the man he once called a friend. "Don't you see?" Martin hissed, his breath hot against Charles's ear. "You can't escape your past. It will always come back for you." With a surge of determination, Charles broke free, pushing Martin away as sirens wailed in the distance. The sound of approaching help was like a lifeline, pulling him back from the brink. "Get down," Lisa shouted, lunging for Martin as he scrambled for the exit. The struggle erupted into a flurry of limbs and desperate cries, and Charles felt the adrenaline coursing through him, urging him to act. But Martin slipped through the chaos, disappearing into the darkness just as the police burst through the door, their presence a blinding light in the abyss. Charles watched helplessly as his past fled into the shadows, leaving behind the remnants of a nightmare that was far from over. In that moment, as he stared into the eyes of the officers, the weight of realization settled heavy on his chest. The web of conspiracy was tighter than he had imagined, and the truth was a double-edged sword. He was no longer just chasing a murderer. He was entangled in a game of power and manipulation that threatened to consume him. As the dust settled and the theater fell silent once more, Charles knew this was just the beginning. The darkness had revealed itself, and he was determined to follow it to the end, wherever that might lead. The echoes of the past were calling him home, and he would answer, no matter the cost. The atmosphere in Salt Lake City had shifted, hanging thick with an unshakable tension. Charles Bennett stood at the edge of the city's beating heart, grappling with the chaos that had unraveled before him. The weight of Martin's words echoed in his mind like a funeral dirge, and every shadow felt alive with the threat of danger. "Charles, we need to regroup," Lisa urged, breaking his reverie as they stood outside the Montgomery Theater, sirens fading into the distance. "The precinct is buzzing. They're talking about you, about the case. We need to go over what we know and come up with a plan." He nodded, the reality of their situation pressing in on him. It felt as though they were navigating a labyrinth with no exit. "Let's head back to my place," he replied, swallowing the dread that threatened to consume him. "We can lay everything out there." The drive through the dimming city was laden with unspoken thoughts. Charles gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white as he fought against the encroaching darkness in his mind. Each streetlight flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows that danced in the corners of his vision. He could almost feel Martin's presence lurking just out of sight, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. When they arrived at his apartment, Charles ushered Lisa inside, the familiar surroundings suddenly feeling alien. The walls seemed to close in on him, memories clinging to every surface like cobwebs. He needed clarity, needed to sift through the remnants of the past to understand how it connected to the present. "All right," Lisa said, shaking off the weight of their harrowing encounter. "Let's start from the top. What do we know about Martin and his connection to the victims?" Charles gestured to the cluttered table strewn with case files and photographs. "He was an officer on the force when the first murders occurred. I always thought he was ambitious, maybe a little too eager to climb the ranks. But this..." He shook his head, grappling with disbelief. "I never imagined he could be involved in something like this." Lisa leaned in, scanning the photographs of the victims that lay scattered before them. The way he spoke, he knew too much. It was almost as if he was pulling the strings behind the scenes. "We have to consider that he might have insider information on our investigations." Charles felt the chill of her words seep into his bones. "You think he's working with someone? Or worse, that he's orchestrating all of this?" "Either way, we have to find him before he makes his next move," Lisa replied, her voice steady but filled with urgency. "If he's targeting us, we need to be one step ahead." As they strategized, Charles's mind wandered back to the theater and the photos of Sarah. It was as if Martin was using those memories against him, manipulating his guilt to push him into a corner. He mentioned a web of secrets, Charles said, a sudden realization igniting in his chest. What if he's using the past to trap me? To draw me into a game where the stakes are more than just the lives of the victims? Lisa's eyes narrowed, and she straightened. Then we need to turn the game back on him. We have to find a way to outsmart him before he has the chance to make his next move. The tension in the room hung thick, punctuated only by the ticking of the clock. Charles felt a growing sense of urgency. They needed to act fast. Let's gather everything we can on the victims, especially any connections to Martin. Maybe he slipped up somewhere, left a trace of his intentions. As they combed through the files, Charles felt a sense of determination building within him. Each photograph of a victim, each document recounting a life cut short, fueled his resolve. He would not let Martin win. He would not let him twist the narrative to fit his dark agenda. Hours slipped by, the night deepening as they worked side by side, piecing together the puzzle. The faint light from the street lamp outside flickered, illuminating the dust motes in the air like tiny ghosts haunting the corners of the room. Suddenly, Lisa froze, her gaze fixed on a name. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a document. One of the victims had a connection to the Montgomery Theater, a stagehand who worked there. He was found dead 3 months before the first murder. This could be the link we need. Charles leaned closer, the words igniting a fire within him. This could mean Martin is following a pattern. If we can connect the dots, we might be able to anticipate his next move. Before they could dive deeper, the sudden sound of shattering glass echoed from the living room, a thunderous interruption that sent them both leaping to their feet. Heart racing, Charles exchanged a glance with Lisa, the realization sinking in. They weren't alone. "Stay quiet," he whispered, instinctively reaching for his firearm, the cold metal reassuring against his palm. They crept toward the noise, the shadows swallowing them whole. As they reached the threshold of the living room, Charles peered around the corner. The window lay shattered, shards of glass glistening like jagged teeth scattered across the floor. Panic surged through him, thoughts racing as he wondered what had happened. "Where are you, Martin?" He muttered under his breath, tension crackling in the air. Then, from the corner of his eye, he spotted movement, an object tumbling through the darkness, skimming across the floor. It was a small box, crafted from dark wood, the lid slightly ajar. A chill ran down his spine as he recognized it, the box from the crime scene. "Charles?" Lisa's voice broke through his thoughts, a sharp note of urgency. "Look." He turned to see her pointing at the wall, where a message had been scrawled hastily in red paint, blood red, the letters dripping as if they were fresh. "Find me before I find you." The words echoed ominously in the silence, a chilling reminder of the deadly game they were caught in. Martin was taunting them, drawing them deeper into his web, and time was running out. Charles felt a surge of adrenaline. "He's playing with fire," he muttered, fury igniting within him. "We need to move. We can't let him stay one step ahead." As they gathered their things, Charles's mind raced. Every instinct told him they were being watched, that Martin was always just out of reach. The game had escalated and the stakes had never been higher. He glanced at Lisa, determination etched on her face. "We have to find him first. No more waiting, no more playing by his rules." They stepped into the night, the city's heartbeat thrumming beneath their feet. With every stride, the tension in the air thickened, and Charles knew that they were diving headfirst into a darkness that might not let them return. But he would confront the specter of his past. He would challenge the shadows that threatened to consume him. The game had begun, and this time, he was ready to play. The courtroom's silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint shuffle of papers and the occasional cough from the audience. Charles Bennett sat in the front row, his hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles whitened. He tried to stay calm, but every fiber of his being was wound tight, buzzing with tension. The trial had been a grueling marathon of accusations, betrayals, and unburied memories, but today was the day it would all come to an end. Across the room sat Martin Graves, his once arrogant smirk now replaced with a cold, calculating expression. His eyes flickered, scanning the faces in the courtroom like a predator studying its prey. It chilled Charles to the bone to think that this man, this monster, had once been a part of his life, his team, but no more. "Charles," whispered Lisa from beside him, "we've done everything we can. Today is about closure." Charles nodded, though the knot in his stomach refused to loosen. He glanced at her, the steady calm in her eyes a grounding force, but inside a storm raged. How could anyone truly prepare to confront the devil they once knew? "All rise," the bailiff's voice rang out, echoing off the wooden walls. The judge entered, his black robes billowing slightly as he took his seat. Tension crackled in the air. The prosecution began with its final statements, methodically presenting the damning evidence against Martin. The murders, the psychological games, the web of deceit and destruction he'd spun over the years. Charles listened, reliving every painful detail of their twisted investigation, every body found, every sleepless night spent chasing ghosts. But it was the defense's turn that had Charles gripping the edge of his seat. The defense attorney stood up, his polished voice confident, smooth. He painted Martin as a man wronged by a system that had failed him, a man pushed to the edge by tragedy and mental illness. He argued that Martin's actions, while horrific, were a result of a broken mind, not cold-blooded evil. Charles wanted to scream. He wanted to shout from the rafters that this wasn't about mental illness. This was about choices, deliberate, calculated cruelty. But he stayed silent, clenching his jaw so hard it ached. Then came the moment he had both dreaded and anticipated. Martin Graves took the stand. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if he owned the room, as if every eye watching him was there to witness his brilliance. He sat, folding his hands in his lap, looking more like a professor lecturing a classroom than a man on trial for multiple murders. "Mr. Graves," the defense attorney began, "can you explain to the court in your own words what led to the tragic events that unfolded?" Martin leaned forward slightly, his voice soft but laced with a chilling undercurrent. "I never intended for things to go this far," he began. "But you see, the world, it's filled with darkness, with people who manipulate and destroy for their own gain. I simply wanted to reveal the truth. About them, about myself, and yes, about Charles Bennett." Charles felt a ripple of shock move through the room at the mention of his name. His pulse quickened. He locked eyes with Martin, and for a moment, the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them. "Charles," Martin continued, "was the one person who could have stopped this. He was there, in the beginning, when all of this started. But he didn't listen. He didn't care. So I had to make him listen." The words hit Charles like a gut punch. His breath caught in his throat. Was Martin twisting the truth to play the victim, or was there a grain of truth buried in his madness? The doubt clawed at him, pulling him into a dark spiral. Had he failed? Had he overlooked something so monumental that it led to this devastation? The prosecutor quickly rose, slashing through Martin's carefully constructed narrative with a series of rapid-fire questions that cornered him. Martin faltered, for the first time, his cool demeanor cracking. He squirmed in his seat, the mask slipping. His calm facade gave way to anger, and as the prosecutor pressed harder, Martin's arrogance turned to venom. He snapped. "They deserved it," he shouted, slamming his fist on the witness stand. "Every one of them. They were parasites, feeding off others, pretending to be righteous. And Charles." His voice dropped to a growl. "He was supposed to be different." The courtroom froze in stunned silence. Charles could feel every eye in the room turn toward him. His heart raced, but he kept his expression steely. He knew now, Martin wasn't just seeking revenge on those he believed wronged him. He wanted to drag Charles down with him, to make him question his own humanity, to taint everything he'd fought for. The prosecutor calmly leaned in. "So you admit to the murders, Mr. Graves?" Martin's lips twisted into a chilling smile. "I don't need to admit anything. The truth is already out there." The prosecutor turned to the jury. You've heard it from the defendant himself. He killed those people in cold blood, and he did it because he wanted to. There was no remorse, no confusion, just malice and control. As the jury deliberated, the minutes dragged on like hours. Charles couldn't shake the feeling that everything hinged on this moment. Justice, redemption, closure, it all teetered on the edge of this verdict. He could only hope that the jury saw through Martin's manipulations. Finally, the foreperson rose, clutching a piece of paper that held the weight of their decision. The room held its collective breath. We, the jury, find the defendant, Martin Graves, guilty on all counts. The words echoed like thunder, washing over Charles in a wave of relief. The air felt lighter, as if a massive weight had been lifted from his chest. He glanced at Lisa, who gave him a tight, supportive smile, and he knew this was the beginning of the end, the start of his healing. Martin sat unmoving, his eyes empty now, as if the game he had played for so long had finally broken him. There was no last-minute monologue, no grand twist, just the silence of a man who had lost everything, including his own soul. As the courtroom emptied, Charles remained seated, staring at the spot where Martin had just been. Lisa rested a hand on his shoulder, her voice soft. It's over. Charles nodded slowly. Yeah, he whispered. It's over. But deep down, he knew the scars would remain. The ghosts of this case, of his past, would haunt him for a long time. Yet for the first time in years, there was a glimmer of hope. Justice had been served, and now, maybe, just maybe, he could begin to rebuild. Stepping outside the courthouse, the sunlight hit his face, warm and inviting. Charles took a deep breath, savoring the moment. The road to redemption was long and uncertain, but today he had taken the first step.